your condescending love, nevertheless, seem delighted by our stumbling, halting words, like a father with a little child who's learning how to talk. Thank you. Glory to your name. Praise you in the highest heavens. There is none like you in heaven or on earth or under the earth. You are God. And being God, you have yet chosen to condescend to us. Praise you. We come today to your word. We confess our ignorance. We confess our lack of understanding. We confess our lack of application. But Lord, we thank you that in your great patience, you continue to give your Holy Spirit to us that we might understand a bit more. And that's our prayer today. Open our hearts to your word, O Lord. And we'll give you thanks. In your name, amen. Delight to see each of you here this morning. I think you made the right choice. Not because I'm here, but because God's here. And it's always a wise choice to meet God. I was going to ask how many of you had done your homework and ask you to raise your hands, but I thought, well, that might embarrass those who for some reason had not. So if you want to get a check mark in the grade book, you can see me afterwards and let me know that you did your homework. And if this were a small seminar class, I would ask you your impressions after having read, and if you're new this morning, we're studying Ezekiel. Somebody told me yesterday that it took them about half the session to figure out it wasn't Isaiah. We're in Ezekiel, and we're looking at chapters 4 through 7 this morning. And I would ask you if it was a small class for your impressions from this reading. And my guess would be that you would say, that's pretty grim stuff. Because it is. And I've got bad news for you. It gets grimmer for the next 20 chapters. It is grim, dark, heavy, hard. And we ask ourselves why. And you have to remember the situation that that Ezekiel is speaking to. We talked about it a bit on Friday morning. Back in Jerusalem, the people are saying, oh, well, yes, we're a little bitty country, 20 by 30, in the middle of this huge new Babylonian empire, but that's all right. We got God. God's on our side. We're the chosen people. God can't get rid of us. Oh, yeah, we're not perfect, just forgiven. Have you seen that bumper sticker? Yeah, there's a few things, God, but my land, we're better than all the people around us. God needs us. Hey, it's going to be all right. There's no problem. And somehow, Jeremiah back at home in Jerusalem and Ezekiel off in Babylon as a foretaste of the captivity to come, these two men somehow have to try to break that stupid optimism. Sometimes optimism is simply not being aware of the situation. And so, each in their own way, Jeremiah at home, Ezekiel writing back from Babylon, each in their own way is being used as a hammer by God to try to break down this blind optimism that is blinding the people to their own condition, to their own need, to their own hope. Oh, I wonder if God is trying to do that for the church in America in the 20th century. Trying to break through the veneer of our own self-satisfaction. Oh, God needs us. Oh, yeah, He doesn't need all those old liberals. He doesn't need all those people. He doesn't need those people that are going to hell in a handbasket, but He sure needs us. I mean, why? If we weren't around, why, God wouldn't have any witness at all in this nation. Poor God And so I wonder if God isn't trying to get through to me and to you in much the same way and say, oh, John, oh, people of my calling, people of my choice, you're in desperate, desperate danger. Wake up. Open your eyes. Let me do in you what I would love to do. I wonder. In this section, which, again, if you're taking notes, we'll call it Roman numeral 2, 4 to 24. Roman numeral 2, chapters 4 to 24, judgment on Judah and Jerusalem. Roman numeral 2. Roman numeral 1 was Ezekiel's calling, chapters 1 to 3. Roman numeral 2, judgment on Judah and Jerusalem, chapters 4 to 24. And the first section is the one we're looking at today, capital A, 4 to 7. Destruction is certain. In these chapters, Ezekiel is trying to get through to the people and say, look, it's not a question of if and. It's a question of it's going to happen. It's for sure. Now again, as I said on Thursday morning, even if all these words had been said in this kind of seriousness, this kind of absolute assurance, if there had been a national repentance at this moment, God would have been glad to say, cancel that. But as of now, he's saying, given the condition of the people now, unless something changes dramatically, it's over. It's done. He gives 4 pictures. Ezekiel is required to act out 4 scenes of the coming destruction. Now this is typical of the prophets. All of the prophets are required to act out what is going to happen. Now some scholars say, oh yeah, this is sort of voodoo, you know. You act it out and so it's going to happen. I don't believe that for a moment. There's not a whisper of that in the prophets, that the prophet is doing this sort of to make it happen. No, what this is an ongoing example of, again, what I talked about on Friday morning, incarnation. God, in order to speak to us, speaks to us in our experience, in our language, in our understanding. And so the prophets are required to picture what is going on here. This is, of course, exactly what Jesus did on the larger scale of his whole life. His whole life was picturing who God is for us. But his parables are the same sort of thing, as he's putting the truth into pictures, into things we can visualize and see. We can see that prodigal son coming back up the road with his head down, wondering, man, is the old man just going to disinherit me for good and throw me out? We can see the father as he sits up and looks. We can see him as he gathers his skirts around his knees and runs down the road to meet this lost boy. We can see it. That's exactly what God is doing in the prophets. We can see the city as it comes to the end of the road. Now I have to say that normally these pictures, these things that God is having his prophets act out, normally they are demeaning and humiliating. Isaiah was called to walk naked for 3 years among his people to symbolize the exile that was coming 150 years in the future. Now I suspect that he probably had on a loincloth. I think if he had had nothing on, somebody would have grabbed him and put him out of sight. But I don't care whether it's Hanes or Jockey's or Fruit of the Loom. If you have to walk around in your underwear all day, that's still demeaning. Hosea was required to marry a woman who was known to be a prostitute. God, what are you doing? And Ezekiel, it's worst of all. We're going to see again and again Ezekiel having to act out disgusting things, tragic things, terrible things. And we say, God, why do you do that to your chosen one? Why do you... He's obeying you. He's loving you. He's serving. Why? And the simple answer, friends, is the only hope for the world is in the destruction of pride. That's what it cost Jesus. Jesus, the Son of God, was demeaned and humiliated. And God says, prophet, you are the forerunner of the prophet. If you're going to confront the evil of the world, don't expect to be thanked. If you're going to confront the evil of the world, don't expect to be exalted and glorified. If you're going to confront the evil of the world, if you're going to bear the sufferings and the sorrows and the shame of the world, just expect it. You're going to be demeaned and humiliated. I'd like to hear Jesus' comments on King's Kids theology. Well, you're a king's kid. King's kids don't suffer. King's kids don't have trouble. King's kids are rich and comfortable and powerful. I don't find Jesus saying that anywhere. I find Jesus saying, hey guys, if they did this to me, what do you think they're going to do to you? Ezekiel is a forerunner of my prophets. What do you think they're going to do to you? People of God, you're the ones who have come as the followers of my prophet. What do you think they're going to do to you? This world, as the hymn writer says, is no friend to help me on to God. Expect it, brothers and sisters. If you serve God in this world, humiliation is much more to be expected than exaltation. As Ezekiel is called upon then to act out the end, there are four pictures here. The second and third are closely related, the first and the fourth not as close, but all of them having to do with what lies ahead for Jerusalem. The first one is there in chapter 4. Isaiah is required to make, Ezekiel. Just whenever I say Isaiah, think Ezekiel and you'll be okay. Spent too long soaking my head in the other book. In the 4th chapter, Ezekiel is called upon to make a model. Now, as some of you know, I'm a model railroader, so this immediately gets my attention. He's required to make a model of the city, a city under siege. Now, as you probably know, before the invention of gunpowder, there was no easy way to get into a fortified city. What you did was you took your army and you surrounded the city. You built a wall outside the city so nobody inside could escape. You had a corps of engineers who would try to tunnel under the wall and undermine the foundations. The Assyrians developed these huge battering rams on wheels, big wooden frameworks with a roof over the top to keep the boiling oil out. And you'd build a ramp up against the city wall and push this huge battering ram up there. It would take perhaps 100 men to operate it and slam that big heavy weight against the wall hour after hour after hour, trying to smash the wall in. Now, of course, all of this was unnecessary if you could find one traitor inside who would open the gates for you. That was the surest way of getting into a walled city. But you couldn't always find a handy traitor when you wanted him. Perhaps 2 or 3 years it might take, depending on how long the people inside could hold out. Basically, what you're trying to do is starve them out. And finally, they're so weak, they're so diseased, so many have died that they can't defend anymore. And finally, you can, if you haven't broken the wall in, you can go over it and attack them. And that's the picture that Ezekiel is supposed to model there. The city, the ramps up against the walls, the battering rams. But the people are saying, that's all right. Ha ha, we got God. And God says to Ezekiel, now, take an iron griddle and set it up there between you and the city, and set your face against it. Ezekiel, you're God. You think God's with you, people? No. God is outside your holy city, and there he is with an iron griddle between you and him, an iron wall between you and him. Oh, it's not the besieging army that is your enemy. It is your God. Harsh words. And then the second image, he is supposed to lie on his side. Bound, the helpless city before her enemies. You lie on your left side 390 days, a year and 25 days. Apparently he did not lie there 24 hours a day, because in the third model, the third thing he's to act out, he's supposed to eat a little bit of food and a little bit of water at different times during the day, like the people in the siege would eat a little bit and drink a little bit. But for at least part of every day, for 390 days, he's to lie there on his left side. And then, when that's done, he can roll over. And now he has to lie on his right side for 40 days. What's going on? Well, the 40 is easier. That's for Judah, we're told in verse 6. Yes, round figures from the destruction of Jerusalem in 585 until the return home in 540, roughly 40 years. 40 years of exile, 40 years of separation from the holy city. But what about that 390? And the scholars have had a wonderful time beating each other up over what that means. And nobody is for sure. The Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which was done in the 200 or so years before Jesus came, this Greek translation has 190 years. That's easier to figure because he says it's for Israel, the northern kingdom. Well, Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, fell in 722. So if you take 722 to the return in 540, that's about 180 years, and the Septuagint has 190. However, most scholars think that's too easy. It would be easier to change this odd 390 into 190 than to go the other way. Well, what does it mean if 390 is right? Well, if you take all the years from the formation of the northern kingdom at the death of Solomon, 930 to 540, it comes out to 390 every time. What is God saying? God seems to be saying that the northern kingdom has been in exile. It has been separated from Jerusalem, separated from God ever since the division of the kingdom. Act it out, Ezekiel. Live it out. Show the certainty of the end. Eat your little bit of food. Drink your little bit of water like the people. Oh, we've got God where we want Him. God will help us. God will take care of us. And they don't understand that God is not for them. He's against them because of their sins. And He says, now you take this little bit of food and you cook it over human dung. The food that they eat during the siege will be polluted. It'll be defiled. Show them, Ezekiel. God, verse 14, God, this is my 30th year. This was the year I was going to enter into the service of the temple. God, all my life I've been careful never to touch anything defiled or unclean or foul. God, this is hard. And God says, I know, son. I know. Tell you what I'll do. You don't have to use human dung. You can use cow dung. It'll work. It'll serve the purpose. Across the Near East, people used cow pies for fuel. That was not uncommon, and it was not considered unclean as long as you kept the fire away from the food. But human dung, that's another story. How like God? God is not like the British say, bloody-minded. Just, this is the way we're going to do it, and we're going to do it, and that's that, so shut up. God may require of us difficult things, hard things, but He does so with the heart of pity, with the heart of compassion, with an understanding what it is costing us to go through this. And He will temper the wind to the shorn lamb, as the saying goes. If there's any way that He can soften it, if there's any way that He can get His point across through us, He'll do it. If God is requiring of you something that is very hard, something that is difficult for His name's sake. Now, some of us are in hard places because we deserve it. That's not what I'm talking about. But if you don't deserve it, and God knows there are many, many who don't deserve the hard place that they're going through. If you're going through a hard place, remember, if you have the witness in your own soul that you're right with Him, that you're clean before Him, remember, His face toward you is not harsh and hard. Go ahead, do it. It's so, child, this is the way you have to walk, but I'll walk with you. And if I can soften the blow in any way that's going to achieve the great eternal purposes, I'll do it. Don't forget that. And then He says, fourth picture, the first one, the model of the city, the siege is coming, and God is standing behind an iron wall. He's not going to save you. The second picture, bound, helpless before your enemies because of your separation from me. The third picture, you're going to eat little bits of food and water, defiled and unclean. The fourth picture, shave your head and your beard. Oh no. If you're taking notes, write down Leviticus 21:5. Leviticus 21:5 says the priest shall never shave his head or his beard. Shave your head, Ezekiel, my priest. Shave your beard. The hair, the beard, that's a man's crown. Respect, dignity. Why, God? Why? Israel has been my crown. Israel has been my glory. And now I'm going to be bereft of her, as you will be bereft of your hair and your beard. Shave it off. Cut it in, separate it in thirds with the scales. Oh, God's justice. God's justice is precise. Weigh it with the scales. Burn a third of it. Whack a third of it with a sword. And the remaining third scatter to the wind. So we see in verses 4:1 through 5:17 this four pictures of what is coming. Then in 5:5 to 17 we have the explanation of the illustrations. So the illustrations are chapters 4 and 5. The illustrations themselves are 4:1 to 5:4, and the explanation of the illustrations is 5:5 to 17. What do we find there in 5:5 to 17? What do these pictures mean? Why is God doing this? And the answer is a rather frightening one. He says in verse 5, "This is Jerusalem. I have set her in the midst of the nations and the countries all around her." Yes, the whole ancient world had its pivot point in the land of Canaan. All the trade from Babylon and Assyria had to come around the northern edge of the desert and down the coast of Canaan to go to Egypt. The trade from Europe, from Greece, came through Canaan on its way to the Red Sea and southward. Canaan was the pivot point. God didn't accidentally put Abraham there. He put Abraham right in the middle of the greatest highway of the ancient world. Why? Oh, Isaiah tells us to be a light to the nations. All the nations were to see the truth of God, the glory of God, the faithfulness of God. It was right there in front of them in the way God was dealing with His people. And what has Judah done? Verse 6. She has what? Rebelled. Rebelled. A rebellious house, Ezekiel. A rebellious city, as we saw in his call. And so what is God going to do? God says, all right, I put you in the middle of the nations so they could see how faithful and loving and holy and true I am, and you rebelled. So there you are in the middle of the nations, and in the middle of the nations, I'm going to show the nations how holy I am through you. One way or another, children, he says, you are going to be a witness to the nations. Either you'll be a witness of my faithfulness to deliver you and protect you and keep you, or you will be a witness of my holy justice. But God, we're we're not as bad as all those pagans around us. I mean, we're bad, but what does God say? Look at it in verse 7. In verse 6. She has rebelled against my judgments by doing wickedness more than the nations, and against my statutes more than the countries that are all around her. Because they have refused my, this particular version says judgments, others will say ordinances. Really, it's my government. You have sinned worse than the pagans because you knew better. You had once lived under my government. You knew my ways. You knew how the world was meant to live, how it was meant to operate. You knew it, and you wouldn't do it. And I declare to you, you are a worse sinner than those pagans who don't know the clarity of my light like you. Judgment begins at the house of God, says Peter. Am I living in the light that has been given to me? Are you? That's what we're going to be judged upon. Judgment is coming, he says. Now he speaks here again and again of abominations. Look at verse 9, for instance. I will do among you what I have never done, the like of which I will never do again, because of all your abominations. The New Living Translation says, because of all your disgusting sins. This word abomination is a word that is repeated again and again in the book of Ezekiel. It is that which is contrary to nature, contrary to the world as God has made it. Mothers who destroy their children. Men who burn with lust for men. Making God in the image of creation. Disgusting. Abominable. A son rebelling against his father. Abomination. Disgusting. Detestable. One of the fascinating things about the book of Ezekiel is that it is the most literary of the prophetic books. Virtually all the rest of the prophets are clearly collections of speeches. Now maybe the prophet wrote the speech down afterward, or maybe somebody was taking shorthand and worked with the prophet to collect them, but they're all collections of speeches except Ezekiel. Ezekiel pretty clearly is written down, bigger blocks of material, probably because it was to be sent back home to Jerusalem. But whether that's the reason or not, it is the most literary of the prophets, and therefore, in many ways, is very polished. But in the middle of the polish, you have some really, really gross words. I'll talk to you about one of them tomorrow and try to do it somewhat delicately. Gross words, gross phrases. They don't come through very clearly in the English, but it's always, I guess,